Welcome to the Superversive SF Roundtable on horror and Halloween. I actually don't have very much to say, or anything to say this time, because this is well outside my area of expertise. But joining us so far, we have Ben Wheeler, Corey McCleary, and El Judgy Lamplighter. Judgy's on the road, so if you hear a little bit of car noise in the background, that's Judgy's fault. Well, I'm going to hand it over to you guys, and I'm basically just going to listen. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Corey McCleary. I'm the author of the serial novel Daughter of Soul in the Astounding Frontiers, issues 2 through whatever they're up to now. I'm also the author of Fever Blood.
5 will be out shortly. On like a week or so.
Okay, 5. All right, yeah, up to 5, yeah. I'm also the author of Fever Blood, an epic fantasy novel that will be edited slowly, so slowly. And yeah, I had to do some reading horror actually in one of my English classes, and I wrote my thesis paper on an author named Arthur Machen and H.P. Lovecraft, who the latter of whom everyone knows. Ben, care to introduce yourself a bit further?
I am the shambling corpse that is pretending it's Ben, or at least that's what the necromancer says, because this is a Halloween-themed podcast. Horror stories during the month of October, and then kind of into November, and then never ever any other time. One of my favorite horror authors, though, is William Hope Hodgson. The Boats of the Glengarry Glen Carrig. There we go. I can never pronounce it. The Ghost Pirates and House of the Borderlands, Nightlands. The dude wrote a lot of just outstanding horror. For myself, though, I've written a couple short stories. I've written In the Seraglio of the Sheik of Mars, which is a serial going through good old Astounding Frontiers. And it's getting real exciting. I understand it's a double issue this time around, 4 chapters. It's infiltrating into the Sheik's harem, which I think shall be interest certainly to all the men out there. I guess that leaves Jaggy to give herself an introduction.
Most illustrious of the
Yeah,
Superversive crew.
talk for just another minute. I'm gunning on an exit. I'll be within a second.
No problem.
All right. So does
So
anyone else get a damp rot in the flesh during the rain? Or is this only a problem for us non-zombies?
well, I happen to and don't suffer early onset putrefaction. So, but I have
neither do I, of course. Not me, but
of course not. Of course,
poor friend.
But the one of the things that struck me with this whole genre was, guys recommended an essay, and it had been recommended by many people, including John C. Wright, on writing fantasy, which was the essay From Elfland to Poughkeepsie by Ursula K. Le Guin. One of the things she talks about is the necessities of the fantastic genre is style. It is not just telling things, but showing things, and showing them in such a way that the reader knows that they're, so to speak, that they're in Elfland, they're in Middle Earth, or Prydain, or wherever it is. The thing, and she gave an example. She read a book, and she basically showed that you can literally change out a few costumes, change out a few, words here and there, and you can turn a fantasy novel into like a political thriller or whatever it is, because that's what is focused on. It's the mundane. It's there's not the nobility or grandeur of fantasy in these. In a lot of modern books, she likened it to, instead of going to say Yellowstone National Park in nature and just being out there in the wilderness, you go in a trailer and you go with a little bit of Poughkeepsie, so to speak, wrapped around you. So you don't really have to go see Yellowstone. You see Yellowstone through suburbia, basically. And I kind of thought,
I have merged, so I could introduce myself, and then we can return to the conversation.
Yeah, no problem.
So My name is Al Judge Lamplighter, and I write the books of unexpected enlightenment, and also I wrote Prosperous Children. I also write essays and short stories and such. I am not a fan of horror. If by horror you mean the gory, creepy stuff that's been popular since the 80s. But I happen to be the sister of a brother who was born on Halloween. So Halloween was always central to my life when I was growing up because we made a big deal about it, because it was birthday. So I love Halloween. And what I love about Halloween is not the gory stuff or the scary stuff or, zombies and bandages, but the creepy, eerie stuff. The more old-fashioned things, ghost stories about that are sort of sad or beautiful, and witches and cats and all these things that have a kind of slight romantic eeriness to them, but which are not horrifying like a Scream movie or Friday the 13th or something like that.
You're gonna like when I go off about Arthur Machen and some of the gothic stuff that we had to learn about.
Corey, I don't know about anyone else. I can't hear you very well. I could before. Is there any way you can turn up your...
Let me see if this works. Is that better?
He's cutting in and out of it, but it was only noticeable when you talked for a while.
Huh.
Which clearly means he's fading in between the worlds and will soon be pulled away on a magical, terrifying adventure this Halloween's Eve.
Unfortunately, it does not mean that. It means that I had to get my headphones that I normally use ended up breaking, so I had these cheap. Blame those. I'm very, very sorry about that. But the thing I was saying was with the From Elfland to Poughkeepsie, the thing that the author Ursula K. Le Guin was saying is that, to some extent, style is really important. Style is part of the vehicle that propels you into Elfland or Witchland or whatever it is. And to some extent, that's also kind of true with horror. The way that style is done, if you look at any of the scenes objectively, you take out style for some really good old horror. The stuff that is eerie and that is creepy. Creepy not in the, perversion kind of creepy, like he's a creepy old man, but more of the creepy, like reading a gothic horror novel, for example. That kind of creepy. With that, style is a huge element to that. Helps weave the atmosphere together, and for some of the more psychological and more the stuff that you see for like gothic novels and stuff like that, that's very important. It's one of the odd things where it's a trend I've noticed that with lots of horror films, there have been the indie horror films that were, I think Andrew Clavin mentioned this, where he said that there have been a bunch of really good indie horror films where they've just been little slight messages to them, but they play it out, and they play it out in a psychologically almost twisted way. I haven't seen, but the other type of horror films you see are the big ones, and they're the ones with all the blood and the guts and the gore. And that.
Well, like first off, Jaggy, I'm sorry. I was just playing around a bit and I accidentally muted you. So be careful when you try to unmute yourself. Sorry about that. So you're right. There's actually I think it's the Hellraiser series. It's got all the gory stuff and the sexuality and all that jazz played to the hilt, but they also combine it with amazing gothic architecture, sort of like the Otherworld, a style in and of itself beyond just Jason chasing down horny teens to horrifically murder them. Because
right.
I guess it just angers him that they're on his Indian burial ground of a home, or whatever it is, until he's in space, which is weird. And I think that ultimately, these, especially the first two, as gory as they were, and they were more gory than just about anything that came before them, and a lot of the stuff afterwards until like the Saw films, you know, they were there at their best when they kept the gothic horror
Are you
sort
talking
of
about
thing.
Hellraiser?
Yes, with
Yeah.
the pinhead, with the pins in the head, and the hyper masochism and stuff like that. Like I've not seen the Jason films, right? But I've seen laser films, which are just on another level. Go figure.
Yeah. Well,
I think that what you're saying here.
Yeah, the thing is with a lot, yeah, that's definitely part of it, because the one issue is the horror aspect is a combination of the brutality of what's happening, and the the sheer gore and the visceral disgust that we'd have. It's the equivalent of watching a butcher go at his work, or someone slaughtering a farm animal. It's that kind of stuff. It's just played up because you see that, and like if you grew up on a farm and your dad had to go, oh, it's time to slaughter a pig. It's not going to do it as much, so they have to play it up so much, and they have to do all these sort of horrible, twisted things. But when you read something like Arthur Machen or H.P. Lovecraft, or there's another guy, I think I know who his name was. I'm trying to remember. Yes, it was a guy named George Lepard who wrote a Philadelphia called The Quaker City, or The Monks of Monk Hall, which is a very, very sensationalist Gothic novel about Philadelphia. And since the school I was going to for this class was around Philadelphia, we had to research a little bit about it, and it was pretty like very much into the Gothic scene. And one of the things that is present in the works of, to some extent, Lovecraft, though he's more secularized of it, and more in the Pard and Mac, and more in keeping of the Gothic tradition, is this idea of a moral horror to it. Not just the idea of, oh, you're going to die, or oh, you're going to go insane, but you're going to doom yourself by engaging in these forbidden or horrible practices. For example, the novel The Quaker City focuses around this area called Monk Hall, which is this cavernous building in the middle of like a maze of corridors in Philadelphia, which, if anyone knows the history of Philadelphia, it was planned out to be on a grid and as orderly as possible, and it just kind of devolved from there. And this was before that de-evolution into the more chaotic streets that we know today. Chaotic in the sense of chaotically organized and planned. This was before that happened, so it was, creating a labyrinthine, dark, decrepit city. And then there's Monk Hall, which was like the pits of depravity and debauchery. There's a lot of satyr imagery because they represented excess and unchained libido, stuff like that. And it was all the businessmen, all like the clergy, everyone who was anyone in society went to Monk Hall and engaged in all sorts of, and somebody's sister got abducted and taken there. And it's very sensationalist. It has like trap doors and hidden walls, and like the floor falls off. It falls out in one room and nearly sends a guy plummeting to his death. But that idea was the idea of there being some element of debauchery, and right there, it was basically a bunch of con men, murderers, everyone who was a scoundrel and a horrible person congregated in Monk Hall. And yeah.
That reminds me of Eyes Wide Shut, a Kubrick film. One of the latter ones he did. Yeah, with the it's weird, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of inspiration there.
Probably keeping in the Gothic tradition, because you see that a lot. The idea of like debauchery and decadence, especially.
Also, a sort of I don't know about. Yeah, I think there's a subtlety to it the inbreeding side of things. Like it's not just debauched and decadent and all that jazz. It is also crumbling, decayed, and incestuous. The original Gothic novels, which is in itself a sort of horror. Like there's a giant that shows up, a giant. Let's see. Sorry, we're checking out audio stuff to make sure we're going through here. There's a giant. Them through the floor, and there's secret rooms, and it's implied that the great aunt is a giant inside one of the halls. Like it's really terrifying, and then it gets to like where the father starts going crazy and going after like his son's fiance or wife and daughter. Like he tries to put away his own wife so that he can bear a son. His line doesn't die out.
There's some element to that in there's a Lovecraft story I had to read called The Rats in the Walls, which I mean that was creepy and twisted. I mean the issue was the name of the cat kept jarring me. But then again, it was Lovecraft, it was the time he was from. But the thing with the story was it slowly had the guy descended into madness after he took ownership of this giant crumbling ancestral manor that he owned, and he could hear the rats in the walls, and the rats were actually his inbred so much that they've lost all humanity and become these degenerate life forms. And apparently it ended with him snapping, going insane, and eating someone, which, yeah, that's Lovecraft for you.
I got a different interpretation. I thought that the rats had eaten all the inbred degenerates he had under his castle.
I thought they were the ones, and it was also kind of him going insane. We don't really know because, I mean, the story ends with the guy revealing, oh, he's in a mental asylum.
Yeah. Which is in itself a horrible, horror thing. There's a pretty good,
especially in the early times before mental care, began to, actually improve. It was some of the treatments they used were pretty nasty. Sorry, Ben had to leave us for some technical difficulties. But anyway, this idea of one of the things. Oh, you're back again.
All right, I'm back.
One of the things I was about to go on was there's this idea of a moral failing that leads to this. That even to some extent, the slasher films have dim echoes of it, though it's much less pronounced as something like a Gothic book or Mackin or this George Card, for example. He's the one that we actually had to study and read some stuff out of, and it was rather appropriately, sensationalist in its nature. I would not classify the Quaker City as like high literature or highbrow literature, but it was it kind of caught the Gothic elements and introduced it into the city of Philadelphia.
I mean, when you get old enough, when any city gets old enough and has enough of a history, it becomes Gothic. Like, I would say that London, I've walked the streets of London before, there were places that I could say, yes, I understand the Victorian preserved areas, so on and so forth. Yes, these places are Gothic.
There are very few of those left now after like the Great Fire and stuff that just wiped out like large portions of the city.
16 something or other. It's more just being replaced. Also, they used a lot of arsenic and asbestos and other things like that. So, like, if you go into an old Victorian house that hasn't been renovated, it's almost a death trap. And I'm talking about this because this is horror right here. Like, the walls can have bubbles of I think it's cyanide or arsenic or something like that gas, because the glue they used to keep the wallpaper, which was the craze at the time, like bubbled out over the century, until it becomes like if you pierce it, like you're getting a spray of arsenic in the face. There's rust everywhere, rot. It's one about it. It's like, yeah, real life is the real horror.
Yeah, well, one of the other things was with Arthur Machen. He was one of the guys who introduced a lot of elements of what we consider Lovecraftian stuff. I have this suspicion that Lovecraft took a lot of stuff from him. If you read like The Three Impostors, which I know John C. Wright mentioned in an article he wrote for, I believe, Castalia House, it's very much it reads like a Lovecraft story, though a bit different in presentation, just because it's from a different author. He doesn't so much focus on space. I think that's where Lovecraft's stuff really deviates, where instead of setting it in the Welsh countryside like Machen does, or in London, he sets it in Arkham, Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island, or other places in the Northeast. And then he adds extraterrestrial origins as opposed to subterranean ancient origins. For example, the novel of the Black Seal is really like that. It's in the Three Impostors, and it's about it's about a woman who becomes the secretary, and this was written in like the 19th or the 20th century, like right around then. It's
Right.
about a woman who becomes the assistant and the secretary to a professor of, I think, archaeology. It's been about a year since I've read it. And he finds this black seal with the label Ixchashar on it. AX.
Don't worry about it. What does it mean?
Yeah. It was from an ancient subterranean city that predated the Hittites and had like all these tunnels under the earth, and the inhuman denizens were the inspiration for the idea of the Fae, the Tuatha De Danann, and specifically the fairy mounds where the little folk supposedly lived. And it turns out,
Those have been around since like the 1400s.
oh yeah,
That's an old trope beyond Machen and any of us.
I know. Well, one of the funny things is what he does is he shows how he doesn't whitewash what the Fae are. He doesn't turn them into like Disney fairies. But then he says, those were the whitewashed, and those were the versions than what the Ixchasharians actually are. And it ends with him, crawling, writing a letter saying, "Oh, if you get this, I'm probably dead. I've decided to go investigate one of the ruins. Here's what happened when I tried to hypnotize someone who I thought was a member of this, and let's just say that tentacles and stuff that Lovecraft's famous for show up here."
Tentacles. I imagine so.
Yeah, it's
Actually, what did he write?
He wrote he wrote the Three Impostors, and he wrote a really actually a book that's considered like a classic horror book called The Great God Pan, which I know Stephen King has cited as being really, really formative. And it's one of the better books out there, horror-wise, that I've read. It's also there. It's very psychological, and it's very Victorian, and very, there's a moral element to it that makes the horror more pervasive.
Right.
The thing with what
Victorian stuff, like you're talking about, because he wrote it around the 1890s or so. Great God Pan. The other thing I'm pretty sure is in the similar sort of way, just about when they were discovering the first of the underground cities of the Hittites and Troy and a few other places like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I was struck to mind of a film about a house that has fairies of sorts in like underneath the garden and the well and all that jazz, and they're obsessed with Del Toro. obsessed with stealing people's teeth. Which is
Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, I think it was. It was a remake.
Yep. And it's actually Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. That's right. It's actually one of my favorite horror films. Not because it's like, oh, it's super scary or gory or whatever, but because it's a fantastically atmosphered and paced out horror film with a tiny little monster that wants to rip out the teeth of children.
Always pleasant.
And who, yeah, like give me a teeth sort of thing. Like he just starts shouting at it, like jumping at somebody's mouth, like it's, whew, it's creepy in its own way. There's also what is it? Like ethic stuff, like filmmaker. I think he really hits it.
The thing is, though, the idea of this atmospheric element to it is very, I think, very important. It makes it much more lasting. Like the common thing that horror is viewed as today is like slasher films and stuff, which is, as I said, that's more of a butcher kind of.
And I'm not saying but I'm saying that Don't Be Afraid of the Dark isn't a slasher film. It's gothic horror.
I know. I'm not saying that, but that's the stuff that, like, if you say horror, people immediately nowadays think slasher film. They think, Saw or Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street or stuff like that. I don't know about Nightmare on Elm Street so much, or a Stephen King novel. The thing is with some of this stuff, like with the Great God Pan. Remember how I mentioned in the monk hall from the Quaker City where they had the satyr imagery for all they represented? That plays here, except they go with the other one, which is the adaptation where Christian culture and Christian mythology has kind of appropriated the image of the satyr as their figure of the devil. Satan is very often depicted as. It also might go back to their idea of a scapegoat, with the actual being an actual goat that escapes. That could also play a part into why they adopted that. But the Great God Pan, the basic summary is a guy goes to see an experiment that someone performs where they induce a lesion in a woman's brain to make her see the Great God Pan and see some sort of inner, beauty. It then horrifies her, and she becomes a mute idiot. Then, like, fast forward 20 years later, there's this woman going around named Helen, who's a young woman around 20 or so, going around, and wherever she goes, mysterious deaths and suicides follow. And it turns out she's the daughter of this woman named Mary. Done. After Mary saw the Great Month Pan, 9 months later, a girl named Helen shows up. After the test subject becomes catatonic. And yeah, basically Helen is not actually human. She's, from my guess, a Cambion, a half demon, and it's that element of the decadence and stuff with her, because she goes into parties and stuff, and when someone has her stay overnight at their house, they end up finding them the next day hanging from the rafters, and it's you don't see any of the gore. The most graphic, so to speak, scene is at the end where they confront her and she starts transforming as she's dying after she ends up killing herself. But the idea of that decadent aspect of it and that danger to someone's soul really played it in. Plus, the atmosphere in it was just spot on, where a guy was sneaking around in this woman's house trying to figure out what happened because his friend had just hadn't interacted with her, and now he was destitute. And it's just the atmosphere is just perfectly done. And the funny thing
Well,
was, by our
I'll
by
get-
our standards, it would be like PG rated maybe, and it was treated as, you know, I'm reading on Wikipedia. Someone said that a literary critic said it was too morbid to be the production of a healthy mind. This is
Yeah.
tame.
they're not totally wrong. Like, these things do have to have an element of being able to see sort of beyond what is healthy and normal. You know, horror is, while it's one of the big you know, sort of genres, it's still in itself about perverting nature towards horrific ends, whether it's something like somebody's daughter, or the you know, like a giant castle in an arcade family, or, you know, the last of a dying breed, like in Poe's work of the House of Usher. But one thing that struck me is when you said the peril of the soul, or talked about the soul or whatever, because that's a big part of a lot of horror stories, especially from Europe. Not so much America, whether we're too practical for souls or whatever. You know,
We're
it
too
doesn't really show up
capitalists.
in
When
our
we hear
horror.
about selling someone's soul, we think, okay, what's the supply and demand for that?
Well, it turns out supply and demand is a violin duel with your soul on the line, or a pretty sweet guitar. Great guitar lessons. Like, there's a funny thing with American Dad, where Roger gets guitar lessons from the devil to win a contest against a hipster. And so the hipster's like, well, you won this contest, the store's yours, but I really need it to make my rent. Well, Roger thinks about it for a second. He goes, well, okay, you can keep your job here, but you got to cover the cost of my guitar lessons. Done. Shakes hands on it. The guy's dragged to hell. It's actually really funny, but the in a horrible way. But like, one of my favorite Scottish fairy tale books is called The 12 Great Black Cats. 12 Great Black Cats and Other Eerie Scottish Tales by Nick Leodas. I have no idea. It's very Gaelic name, but ones that always leave church on Halloween, even though they clearly should, and tries to eat them. Their soul, a number of things. A story of a dancing and mourning, and so she dances. Someone dances with her, and then he tries to take her back into her. I really wish there was something I could do about that. My internet is clear.
You're better now. Sorry.
All right.
Dropping in and out again.
Well, with the 12 Great Black Cats and the red one, like, somebody goes, you know, oh, I don't have to go to church on Halloween. And everyone's like, no, you should. You know, the devil's about. And then, of course, he meets the devil in the form of a cat who tries to eat him in payment of singing him terrible cat songs. And he is just barely, you know, able to escape when the parson comes up with a bottle of holy water because he heard him shouting for help while the cats try to eat him, and disperses the devil and all his minions. It's a great story. Like, those type of stories is another level of horror. It's a spiritual horror. Another book like that in the Gothic tradition is Vathek. Sorry, VTH. And Prince, who William Beckford. Try reconnect. Okay, I'll be back.
Yeah. Sorry about that. We're having technical difficulties. Apparently, the foul, blasphemous spirits are haunting our Wi-Fi connections. And they're as we said, the foul, blasphemous spirits are haunting your internet connection and my microphone, and Jaji's thing apparently as well. But yeah,
Well, that was
that's
by accident. But what was I saying? Oh yeah, Vathek. I'm gonna get back to that while Leah thought's still fresh. He goes over through these horrible things, causing all sorts of misery. He starts out in a life of charmed goodness. He has 5 different palaces, each one devoted to a different sense. Like incense in the palace devoted to smells, food in the palace devoted to the tongue, so on and so forth. But he gives it up and literally travels into hell with the evil daughter of some mystic, evil mother, and they literally just sort of chill out there for a bit.
Mhm.
Eventually, stuck there forever. Which I think is, again, a very effective horror that doesn't really show up as much as I believe it should.
no nowadays the issue with a lot of horror films, and it also goes into horror video games to some extent, is the idea of there being no real, like, if you die in the world that's been set up, which is a very materialist world, if you die, you die. You basically get butchered like an animal, and nothing happens. It's very nihilistic, and the issue with the nihilistic horror is it can't scare you so much as when I say it can't scare you as much, I'm talking about the idea of the main character. If they die, they just die. Nothing happens. And the way that people will get around is they'll make them die and then have you revel in their suffering. They things like H.P. Lovecraft.
Right, well, they can't have a character like die and go to hell. Like
No.
like what happens when you retry is there like just multiple copies of the same person in hell wandering around. But or purgatory.
Sure.
I'm sure somebody's like
Right.
twitching at that.
But the issue with where I was going with this was you have certain people who do that. There's a game I remember seeing a bit about that I thought might be onto this. It's The Evil Within, because instead of you going to hell, it's insanity. That's the other one that people will go to. Lovecraft goes to this. I think The Evil Within does it too, because I think the basic premise there is you basically get your brain plugged into like the shared reality with someone else, except the guy who's running it is a sociopathic serial killer.
Oh boy.
Yeah. I think I saw a playthrough of The Evil Within and The Evil Within 2 I'm looking at, because horror's never really been my genre, but some of the ideas are kind of interesting. I've always written, like, David Halquist's, one of the guys in the Superversive, God bless his soul, is reading through Fever Blood and giving me advice, and one of the things he says is that my bad guys are really, really bad. As in, your Dark Lord, is raising the dead. Mine can see the price of your soul, knows what he can get to earn your unwavering attention. If that doesn't work, he'll just suck your life force out and then flay you alive. Guys.
You see, I don't know about that. You see,
Well, there's other things.
I think it takes the fun out of it. Right. But the bartering, I know what you're going for, and I did. I think that if the villain can't barter with somebody, if they can't like size them up and like actually play a verbal game with it, it sort of devolves to, like, Satan knows pretty much everything and better, of course, but he doesn't have the quality of omniscience. So he still has to, at least in the stories anyway, tempt us with something that we can fall into temptation with. But we still have that choice to come out of it. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? Like, if Satan came a gold violin, if I beat him in a fiddling contest, no thanks. But then if he offered something else, like, a pretty girl, but she turns horrible, at night or whatever.
Then again, my story is not a horror story. It's also an epic fantasy, so. There's that element to it too.
I'm keeping my points. No matter the genre.
I get it, but it's that element of the bordering that is, or the not bordering per se, but the idea of that temptation that is that adds an extra depth to an extra fear.
Well, no, I'm saying that if Satan knew so deep into my soul, he knew exactly what would tempt me, and I'm pretty sure he does. But like, if it was super easy for him, there's no drama there. Like, that doesn't make in itself a good story. Me, me getting hungry and stealing candy bars or something like that. If that's my thing, that isn't horror. That's just like an addict story,
Mm-hmm.
And hitting people on their addictions. It's. Yeah. And so, maritime horror. Have you ever read any maritime horror, Corey?
Not. Unfortunately, the most of the stuff I've read is in my research of Lovecraft for a project, for the final project that I did in conjunction with Mackin and some other stuff like that. I think I read like one Stephen King book, and I found that more tragic than horror.
I have yet to read a Stephen King book, and I'm happy with that.
I've heard this gets weird in some of his books, but
yeah, it does.
But I've not read much maritime horror. I will.
It is a thing as separate to itself as gothic horror is from like slasher fix. I'm actually quite partial. Ooh, read them growing up. I like Christine. Is it Stephen King or is it
Sorry, yes. I used to read Stephen King growing up a little bit, and I read Christine, which I remembered, and then I enjoyed it. I don't really remember the others.
Neither does Stephen King.
Yeah. He does seem to have gone
the real horror is his cocaine addiction. Yeah.
Anyway, I'll leave you guys to it.
Yeah. And I know that you've read William Hope Hodgson, haven't you?
Me? He's on my list, my huge list, but I've not gotten to him yet.
Maybe jack that up a bit, because he actually wrote some really great maritime horror, which I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast. Especially since you can get a great sense of isolation, but also have an excuse to have like 100 people around. And then also move into super weird adventure like The Life of Pi, which I know a lot of people read. Don't worry about the movie. Sort of delves into horror when he comes across the floating. That's my little brother coming through. Comes across the floating plants where he finds the skeletons and the teeth in the fruits of the trees. Because they've been digested by the plants, much like a man-sized flytrap, which is terrifying if you think about it, but adventurer fare we have not seen for some time, outside of cartoons.
Yeah. But so is that an element of kind of a, so what would you say, like, I'd say the things that really define gothic horror is this idea of the past coming back to haunt people. And when I say define, it's not a hard definition. It's more themes that are just very reoccurring. The idea of the past coming back to haunt people, decadence, and this idea of this sin and evil corruption that people engage in, creating other monsters, and very often it's set in very old and crumbling, and kind of the very setting is rotting and decadent.
Now, real quick, I'm going to reply to Bar One Studios. You're right, addiction topics are an acceptable topic for horror. I'm just saying that when it comes to deals with the devil, you can't build up tension unless he has to sort of fumble for it a bit, or at least sort of build up to the thing that'll get the person to fall into it. Like if he just kicked down Stephen King's door and shoved cocaine into his nose, it's not a good story. It's just something bad happening to a former addict. But if, say, Stephen King walks down to the crossroads and discovers you know, just a brick there, you know, and it's sort of building up and up and up, and the brick is mysterious, like who did this sort of thing. That's more of a way to do it. And that's the distinction of what I'm saying. You can have a dick like Renfield is a good example. He is addicted to Dracula in a way, and has to serve him to get his sort of like vampiric fix of servitude as Dracula has hypnotized him. However, if he just like the horror of Dracula is being the vampire, it's not about Renfield's addiction.
Mm-hmm. I also read.
I don't know how to respond to that comment. I'm sorry.
I also read. No problem. I also read Dracula, and the thing with Dracula is you also see an element of Stoker's Catholicism show through, because the idea of the crucifix and the sacraments. Myself, I'm not Catholic. I'm a Protestant, so it was not as clear to me until I learned about it more. Those are the things that repel Dracula, because he's not just fallen man, but he's the opposite. He is everything that was good, the redeemable qualities of man, inverted into a demon of sorts. He's not like the way that vampires are viewed nowadays is that they're like humans, except they're sick with something. That sick thing makes them cooler. That's not how vampires were. They were not, oh, you can redeem them. It's like there's nothing left in there to redeem. You're basically a bloodthirsty husk. Just enough of a personality to charm you into being fed upon.
Right.
And that the horror with that is the idea of Dracula not being the demonic, and the real horror, I'd say to some extent, is what you see happen with Lucy and what's her other name? Is it Mira? No.
Don't worry about
Mina
it.
Harker.
Mina, there we
That's
go.
Lucy and Mina, the two women that he starts transforming into vampires. The horror you see is they're incapable of doing certain things, like the host. The Eucharist burns Mina's head when Abraham Van Helsing puts it on her. And leaves a scar that refuses to heal. Lucy starts getting consumptive and slowly dying until someone gives her a wreath of garlic to wear. And that starts to make her become, revivified. And then someone takes it off because it was sticking up the house.
Right. Stupidity in horror films. Like, I guess, sure, if teenagers weren't stupid, we wouldn't have horror films. But at the same time, there's got to be a limit. There's a funny commercial that's in my movie theater now about some people. It's like, hey, let's hide in the room full of chainsaws. Yeah, there we go. It's like, what about that car over there? Just a second.
Yeah, no.
Don't be crazy.
Yeah. Well, I've seen something where it goes, oh, we'll take B-rated horror films, tropes, and then have everyone actually be smart. So instead of the dumb blonde who wanders out into the dark shouting, hello, hello, is anyone there, with only a flashlight and nothing to defend herself with, being so loud that everyone within 2 counties can hear her, especially the monster, except for the people back
wearing
at the base camp.
Wearing a too-thin tank top and some Daisy Dukes, right?
Exactly. Instead of that, this guy gives her a high-powered rifle, and vampire shows up. Instead of screaming in horror and getting eviscerated, she puts 2 in his head and collects the bounty. That, of course, is Larry Cleveland's Monster Hunter books. But those are
exactly.
I wouldn't put them as horror.
I consider them action horror. It's similar, like it's between slasher films. Like it's like where some of the Alien films and Predator films lie. It's in that genre of science fiction horror sort of thing. Not that it's about as science fiction as Dresden Files are, fantasy, whatever you want to call it. Not that fantasy and science fiction are the same. What was I doing? All right. No, I forgot it.
There was one thing I was going to say, that there's very often a element of I think there's a difference between horror and dark fantasy, because I always used to see the two kind of conflated. And I think I've actually kind of figured out what the difference is. In that horror, one of the main things that you constantly see is this idea of futility in, in a H.P. Lovecraft story. I remember I saw an author, a very far left author, say that she was writing a Lovecraftian world because now she get to, have the diverse masses punch out Cthulhu's. Like, you don't get Lovecraft. Cthulhu.
Right.
You don't
having your magical black person punch out Cthulhu doesn't work.
No.
It doesn't work at all.
The Cthulhu is not just that. It doesn't matter what your race is. It doesn't matter what any of that is. It's Cthulhu. The way you win in a Lovecraft story is you survive. You find a hole to crawl into as the world ends around you, and you get to keep your sanity before something crushes you.
I don't know. Like, the thing I get from Lovecraft is that, first off, the story about Eric Zahn is, by and large, one of my favorite of his works, with the violin playing against the dark of the night, and there's nothing beyond in the dark but something terrible and terrifying. But also, I kind of get the sense from Lovecraft that even though there's a lot of things sort of crawling through, it's like cracks in the wall rather than full-blown door opening. Like Cthulhu rising out of Deep Relay, that's the door opening. But otherwise, like, most people will live their lives without seeing a cursed statue, without ticking off some witches, or going so deep into Boston you just go down a wrong alley and end up cursed, or New Orleans with voodoo priestesses. Like, like, the part of the horror isn't so much that these things are roaming everywhere, but rather that you can stumble on them without meaning to, or even meaning to, like, you're not prepared.
Right.
And then, well, you're crazy, or you're a host for the lingering bloodworms, or a cultist, or any number of things. Zombies. Except they're not like spreading zombies, just want to kill you to make sure their parts are fresh. Any number of things. Ghouls, perhaps, yes.
But one of the things I've noticed with a lot of horror and a lot of effective stuff is that main characters can't, go in and just dispel the evil. Tracking down Dracula, even when they do that, it's a Herculean task, because this fiend is so evasive and so they're so evasive, and so you can't just, I'm gonna go find Dracula and shoot him. You have to take all these different measures. You have to decapitate him, you have to put garlic in his mouth, you have to drive a stake through his heart. But the difference with that in dark fantasies, it has a lot of the trappings of horror, all the undead, very oftentimes a lot of the gore, except the main characters are actually capable of doing stuff in a much easier way than a lot of horror, where there's not as much of a struggle, so to speak, if that makes sense.
Sure. But I think struggles evolve. Like, Dracula was one of the three first, like, vampire stories or whatever that reached a sort of, like, mainstream acceptance beyond local myth and legend. And to kill him, we can't, like, you can write a good story about repeating the same processes, and they do happen. Like, Batman Vampire is one of the best horror comic books ever written. But, like, if Larry Correa has, high-powered shotguns, blowing away the vampires, or Jim Butcher having like the various vampire courts and then wiping out an entire court of them with a human sacrifice on top of an Aztec pyramid. Like,
yeah,
we can do vampire horror like forever, but the thing is that we can no longer just creep into the castle directly. Like, you can do that if you do it a certain way. I'm not saying that it's like an impossibility, but like the way they did it is like, wow, we've done it. We've actually killed a vampire, and it didn't involve the whole village, driving stakes into a corpse after digging it up from the graveyard. And then all of a sudden we have the castles, we have Castlevania, we have, all sorts of genres
They've
here.
scaled it up.
Yeah.
To make it actually harder as other stuff evolves.
Now, there is another horror that I recommend to everyone, and that's Perdido Street Station by China Mielville, who is a mad communist, but he's quite excellent when he writes.
I've heard that Mielville's stuff is not as much horror as much as just weird fantasy steampunk stuff.
It's part of a genre called New Weird, but it is horror for that genre. The villains literally suck people's brains out. They have a spider that will randomly kill people based on the amount of scissors in a room, or whether he got the right scissors. Like, they have actuary tables to see what the spider likes, and so they give it to him for help. There's a villain who is always changing in form, and he hires the girlfriend of the main character to build him a statue to, take care of it, sort of thing, because he can't have a mirror or anything. There's a lot of horrific elements to it. You see, Raindrop says New Weird isn't a genre so much as it is a failed literary movement. I disagree in the sense that I believe that it was in the wrong hands. I kind of I like a lot of what they did, but the people who wrote it did not have the sticking power. Bar One Studio says the only way to really kill a vampire to good is to turn his skin into a souvenir wallet. I would only disagree in the fact that that's how we deal with werewolves. Werewolf leather brings the best wallets. This video is funded by Werewolf Leather Wallets Incorporated. If you have a cousin who's a werewolf, just send them our way. You see, that's what we need to do. We need to get sponsored videos.
Then
when I start doing my own thing, that's what I'm doing.
We're not allowed to procure people for the sponsors.
Right, but I'm saying that I'm tired of these werewolves all over the place, and that there's a nice little building that they can go into that always smells of fresh meat. You see where I'm going here? Which reminds me of the suicide booths from the King of Yellow. There we go. Bring this full circle back to the Gothics.
Good. It's the King in Yellow, the book that supposedly, the play, I should say, in the book of the same name, it supposedly drives you mad as you try to finish it.
Yep.
Also
and
inspired
then,
H.P. Lovecraft.
Yep, and it's interesting because it's a subtly different from our own, yet close enough that we recognize it. Except for, of course, the suicide booths in New York City, which is a whole interesting set of ideas, but I wouldn't call that horror. Well, some of it is horror, but their existence in and of themselves isn't horror. It's just a large part of it. Somebody's messaging.
Yeah, that's Jason.
Huh.
That's weird. I can deal with that. Please lecture us on the King in Yellow.
So I haven't read it in a while, but I like I'll use this to segue into more internet computer stuff. Hold on. Sorry, for the SCP Foundation, which is in itself probably the premier new age technology horror series, which essentially is a combination and collection of all the copy passes that floated around the internet for a while. Cursed Children, Able.
Continue. I will try to manage this.
Because I think Jason was the one.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Sorry, we have, for context, we have Jaddy trying to get back in, and shenanigans are internet shenanigans. As we said, this stream is haunted. Shenanigans are
absolutely. It is about a 79 haunted on the 1,000 scale. We're currently going up to about an 80 haunted. Hold on to your butts. This is going to be a wild ride. But and the longer we talk about it, the more haunted it gets. I have to leave in 15 minutes, though. What was it? SCP Foundation. SCP Foundation is pretty great. It's got all the scary. I know, right? Suicide Boost is the first clue the narrator might be a bit off.
Judgy, you made it.
Ah, you're back.
But you're muted.
So I'm still kicked out, but I came in as a different login.
That's
Sorry about
weird.
that. I didn't realize ejecting you would permanently eject you from the call. Because I was trying to get you disconnected, and that was the only option I had.
We'll hopefully work it out next time, or I'll just come in this way.
Very sorry about that.
No problem. I'm sorry too. I mean, I was going along, enjoying the listening to you guys, and then I guess I hit a point where I was just lost.
Yeah. Anyway,
Ben broke it.
Yeah, I did. It's my bad. I'm sorry.
As you were saying about the SCP Foundation, I've had some experience with this on my own.
Right. And actually, like, I've been following it since it was only like 1,000-ish, like, incomplete entries. Right now, it's in the 3,000.
Can I quick give a little two-sentence summary of what it is? For those of you who aren't aware, the SCP Foundation is kind of an online community where people will go and they will write up containment and treatment protocols for these weird anomalous objects or people or things. And they basically, it's like SCP and then a number. And so what we're saying is there's like 3,000 or so of these already out.
Upper 2,000s, like they're up to 3,000 right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And some of them are harmless, like cure-all pills, but everything is unexplainable. They can't break down what it is or why it does it. They can't, like, it usually kills people in any number of horrible ways. If they, break an ancient statuette, they might unleash Tiamat. Like it's one of those things where they have to be like super careful, and the statue is suicidal. Not that that's like there's another one. If nobody's looking at something, it disappears, kills somebody random in a populated area. And everyone who looks at it dies. Like it's a whole bunch of really terrible things. There's a stop
others that are yeah, some of them are it goes from everything from like a household object to a person to places. Like there's one where it's actually one of them's a tattoo. That's a dragon tattoo that you literally have to care and feed for by like tattooing food onto someone's skin, and then it goes and eats the food. And stuff like that, where it can be everything from that, which is kind of cool, to, oh, this object contains this weird being that kind of kills people with a thought. Wake it up.
Well, there's one of my favorite ones is a series of stories about some agents exploring a dead world and trying to figure out what's going on. Like it's like one of those things from the Rapture, like all the clothes are that's organics was alive, that is gone. What's causing it, and there's these giant like slug-like things going about on the feet like men, and having arms and stuff like that, reaching out to them and like plucking people from their clothes to join the Gestalt. Terrifying beings, and there's all kinds of other horror aspects to it. Like the best example of new media horror out there. Like there's also It's and Freddy's and and there was another one, Bendy and the Ink Machine, for like what we would call new media or video games, online stuff as well. And I've done some dives into like the deep web and stuff like that, and sometimes you come across like some of the really strange websites of like horror, like they're trying to do something and you follow the website to and go deal horribly, of course.
You cut out there. I couldn't hear what you said.
There's scary websites all over the place that also act like this, but they're not as well known as the SCP Foundation. Some of which are on the deep web, which is just a random place. If you stay away from the bad stuff.
Right.
No, I've been on horror sites before, like years ago, like back before it got popular to be on it.
Like horror
like
stories.
you'd also have art
when you're saying horror
installations.
sites, you're not talking about sites with horrific content as much as like storytelling sites about horror or stuff like communities built around the horror genre, stuff like that.
That's right.
Okay. Maybe we should let Jared
look, man,
about the stuff because he wasn't here at all. I'm sorry, Jaji.
No problem, guys. I'm glad. I didn't want to jump in when I didn't really know what you've been talking to so far, but enjoying hearing.
We've discussed some gothic horror. We've discussed the elements of the idea of decadence and some peril of the soul being involved. All sorts of other stuff.
Let me say just a little bit about what I like and don't like in horror. Maybe we can, kind of go back into, blend it back in. I think the horror that's designed to terrify is not my cup of tea. I mean, I'm not going to diss anybody else enjoying it. It just really isn't for me. And the reason isn't for me, I should add, is I remember going to a horror movie many years ago, and sitting there and being scared and praying really hard, which is what I do when I'm scared. And I thought, why am I doing this to myself on purpose? Here I am praying to overcome fear that I walked into. So I stopped walking into horror movies. I'll go to a movie that's scary if it has something else I like in it, but horror per se, is just not my thing. But I do like eerie. So, when I think of a good Halloween movie, I think of something, something funny like Arsenic and Old Lace, or something like Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And Legend of Sleepy Hollow is not the creepy thing that many people think of because they've seen a movie about it. It's actually a story about a guy who has a prank played on him by his rival for the hand of a girl. And the guy's kind of a jerk, and he's only interested in marrying the girl for her money, and the guy who really likes her plays up the fact this guy is scared by all the ghost tales that are told in that part of the world, and plays a trick on him, and the guy gets scared and runs away. And the guy gets scared.
Was that part of the sandwich?
Sorry about that. The guy gets scared and runs away, and because the rival dresses up as the Headless Horseman. And I particularly enjoy the story because a friend of mine from when I was young is the storyteller who tells the story of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow at the church in Sleepy Hollow on Halloween. He spends a whole bunch of October, telling this story up in Sleepy Hollow. So he wrote a book about the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and his book went into every ghost and goblin and little creature that's mentioned by the author in the book Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He finds out, if there's just a reference to Major Andrew or the white lady up at Raven Rock. He goes into, what these were, what kind of stories these were, who the witch was that was referred to, who was this lady who had some ability to heal with herbs that people kind of turned on, and things like that, the real historical plus the legends. And that kind of thing I really like. It's eerie. It's creepy to hear about the white ladies up at the rock who, are still waiting for the bridegroom who never came or whatever. But it's something kind of beautiful about it, too. Something lyrical. And that's the kind of Halloween horrific things that I like, where it's not done purely for terror. It's more like a slice of the kind of cultural look at what might happen to us after death. Or Major Andre, what I think his name was a soldier who was accused of being a spy because he put on non-uniform, just like someone said, oh, don't go through this territory in your uniform, just dress as a normal person and try to get to wherever he was going, a ship or something. And he got caught. And so the idea that he still felt injustice had been done to him because he was hung for this, stayed in the mind of the locals. So they think they have all these legends about where he appears and what he says when you run into him and things like that. And I took all this and put it in the Halloween scene in my third book, the one that was up for a Dragon nomination, that has a scene of Halloween in the Hudson Valley. So I took all these guys, the creatures and legends and stuff. But I really enjoyed reading about it. It's the exact amount of eeriness that I like. It wasn't meant to terrify. It's not supposed to be gory and bloody. It's much more like a Gothic. You were talking about Gothics earlier, and much less like Friday the 13th or something like that.
Right. The idea of the Gothic being there's very often a element of the past showing up and rearing its head when it shouldn't be. Older things are usually very sinister in Gothic horror. We had to read some. I don't know if you were there when I talked about that part.
I heard the first part of it, so I heard most of it, but I got cut off before you were done.
Yeah, but you pretty much covered everything, I think, while you were still with us. But yeah,
one of my favorite horror stories with that sort of theme is called The Honest Ghost. And it's about a guy haunting this mansion that he used to own. And he was always known as an honest man. And for he's spooking people, he's spooking the mill owners, that sort of thing. And then it turns out that on his desk, which nobody had thought anything of, there was a lantern that man had borrowed on the night before he got the cold that killed him. And that it had never returned because he took to his deathbed. And so the ghost was tortured in heaven, apparently, by the idea that he had not returned a lantern nobody was looking for, and was, shoving it in people's faces to try and get them to take it back to its original owner, which they did. And of course, the ghost had peace afterwards. It's a nice story.
The whole thing nowadays is there's very much an undercurrent of gore and just the visceral stuff, because I think people have forgotten how to have that eerie atmosphere and that slightly sinister tone to things that makes like Gothic horror really go. It's one of the things I was kind of alluding to with From Elfland to Poughkeepsie when I mentioned that at the beginning. That's normally about fantasy, but I think it applies to some of the more older types of horror, like Gothic horror, or I think you mentioned maritime horror. I'm not as familiar with that genre, but that could also apply. It's the stylistic crafting that kind of just starts adding things together and contributes to the atmosphere of a work overall.
Yep. It's pretty nice.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we're about 5 minutes away from when we should leave here. I guess I'll have a final thing. On Halloween, I like to watch a John Carpenter film. The gorier, the better, because I like being spooked. Though this year, I believe I am working. No, I'm not working Halloween. That means I'm going to see Happy Death Day at the theater for $5. Huzzah! How about you, Corey? What are you going to do?
For my Halloween, I have a project I have to do, so I'm going to be doing that, and then basically locking the door and getting some work done on a manuscript, because I'm surrounded by college students and I do not want to see their costumes. Some of them are very creative, I will admit, but the ones that aren't, just like, yeah, no thank you.
Oh, you're one of the bimbos that gets killed by Jason. I dig it. You're right.
Yeah.
All right.
What about you, Jazzy? How are you
yeah.
spending your Halloween?
prayer and supplication that the ghosts don't get her? Probably.
And I will be, I don't know, it's just a day here. We don't really celebrate Halloween in Australia. The stores keep trying to make it a thing, but it's never really caught on.
Ah,
I mean, it's pretty like far apart for everyone, isn't it? Compared to America, not much of a small town, so you don't get that same small town horror.
Yeah, we don't. We have small towns, but they're
the small town horror comes with the toxic spiders and the drop bears and all the other things in Australia that want to kill you with.
yeah. The place is normally dangerous.
Right.
They don't need to make it dangerous.
Well, like with the Babadook and stuff like that. I think that's an Australian horror film. And what's the other one? Right. But there's like dream eaters and stuff like that from your Aboriginal people. Yeah.
I'm sure someone's made one of those. I'm not sure on that. How about you, Jack? What do you do for Halloween?
I couldn't hear what you said. You're kind of warbled.
What do you do for Halloween?
Well, it's an interesting question because up until now, we've gone trick-or-treating. And it's the only time we see our neighbors. Our little neighborhood used to actually have a block party for Halloween for a while, and then a couple of people involved with that left. But it's the only time all year that you walk up and knock on the doors and interact with some of the neighbors. So I've always really enjoyed it, but my boys are getting so old that we are thinking that after this year, we should switch to them doing something at our house to welcome trick-or-treaters. Some kind of theme or fun thing so that when kids come to the house, the boys can be dressed up and interact with them here. But I've thought it was really neat the way it was. I mean, I've never seen anybody talk about how Halloween is such a thing where you interact with your neighbors. In our here, it's very short, but it has 125 townhouses on it. And only the ones that put their lights on are the ones that people go to. But there's maybe only 1 in 5 or even 1 in 10 sometimes put on their lights, but that's still a lot of people to go and interact with. And it's really neat. And some of them put up really elaborate, they jump out of the ground from where they were laying pretending to be a zombie or something. So the whole thing is quite delightful and a little bit scary occasionally, but mainly just kind of fun and delightful with neat looking stuff and people dressed up and, taking on a theme. There was one couple that used to always dress up as like Star Wars guys or elves or something, which we always loved visiting them every year. And so I've been really sad at the attack on Halloween that you see in certain parts of America right now, because it is such a wonderful time for the neighborhood to interact. And I'd hate to think that would be lost. We would have no time when we saw our neighbors. But that's what we tend to do Halloween. And I am looking forward to the idea of trying to come up with some either creepy or fun themes to put, to dress our house and front door up in the next few years.
Fair enough. Well, don't forget, I mean, somewhere someone might be having fun, and social justice warriors can't possibly tolerate that.
Yes, they are the fun police, the people who will either stay up all night worried that somebody's having fun somewhere or that somebody's having fun wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah, fun.
All right,
they all have cats. You never know when a cat's disguised as a devil.
Or
that explains spooky.
So on my Facebook feed, I have a thread that's over 200 messages long that's dealing in part with what Halloween costumes we can wear, this idea of cultural appropriation. I cannot think of anything more horrible than telling a little kid, you can't dress up as your favorite character because you're the wrong race.
Yeah, I know, right? It's unbelievable.
It's just outrageous. And it's like they don't understand that if you tell a white kid they can't dress up because they're the wrong race, or you tell a black kid they can't dress up because they're the wrong race, that's the same evil. To a little 5-year-old kid, it's the same thing of being told that you're different, you're not the same, you're not actually good, you guys are not created equal, you're different by skin color. What lesson do you think that little kid is going to learn? Not the lesson they say they want them to learn. So I actually think it's a horrible thing. And what makes me very sad is until like this month or so, cultural appropriation seemed to be one of those fringe things that only a few fringe people believe, but all of a sudden this year,
You'll
semi-decent people are taking it seriously.
see people who are like flipping out that this dude has dreadlocks. He's white, and it's like,
well,
dressing up
like
as
I had
Superman is
dreadlocks for
ableism.
years. I mean, I don't see them going, "Hey, we're not Westerners. We're going to drop jeans, cars, and birth control."
no.
You don't expect them to be consistent, do you?
I was told 2 days ago that I'm extreme because I don't believe in cultural appropriation. That only an extreme person. I'm like, you can't be called extreme for believing something, for not believing in something that the average American liberal or conservative still doesn't know about. Like, if you go out and you talk to people who don't hang out on the web all the time, they've never heard of this.
I've met you. You'd like the exact opposite of the extreme.
I may have some extreme fully rely on God type extreme, but I'm not extreme in the sense of my politics. I try to be kind of gently, towards I'm now a lot more conservative than I used to be, but I'm still kind of towards the middle. I had to give for years I tried to be kind of fair and open-minded to both sides, but what used to be liberal that I was open-minded about is now called conservative, and what's now called liberal actually tends to be immoral and sinful, which is not the same as just having a different opinion. Yeah. So I kind of had to move my stance. That's not really on the subject of horror. Maybe it is. I'm sure we could turn that into a horrific thing.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a horror of its own. But with the cultural appropriation thing, with the costumes, you get that with characters too. Which I don't know how many Dragon Americans there are out there, but apparently I need to start talking to members of their community.
Yeah,
but
one of my friends, who's a pretty liberal guy, was Tolkien okay writing about Gandalf? Okay, do we have to go to
Gandalf isn't even human. He's like some sort of angelic being.
And I should say that was my first response when I first heard these ideas in 2009. Was you can't be a science fiction and fantasy writer unless you believe that you can properly imagine another being.
Yeah,
like
literally.
We could write a good horror story about the world where we're only all allowed to write only about ourselves. That's pretty horrific.
Oh gosh,
write that for Forbidden Thoughts.
I already have a good story. Maybe one of you guys could write.
That would mean we're basically all writing James Joyce style in self-indulgent fan fiction. Oh.
I mean, just look, go to the My Little Pony forums, take a good bit of alcohol with you, and then once you see all the OCs that are totally not the author, they are the author, but all those OCs, as far as the eye can see, it's been written, Shaggy. It's been written so many times.
One of the guys commenting on the thread said, "And now I'll tell you about me. And for a change of subject, more about me."
All right, guys. Well, shall we wrap it up there?
Yes.
It's been fun.
Horrifyingly so.
Sorry we didn't get
Definitely. I'm sorry I only made part of it, but you guys did a great job, and I hope that means you'll be, more willing to come on in the future, knowing you can handle it.
Yeah, we can leave you guys in charge in future.
No dear. Yep.
All right, everyone. Thank you for participating, and we'll be back in a month. Superversive Press has MAGA 2020, MAGA 2020 and Beyond coming out in like a week. And
that's horrifying to a completely different contingent of the.
Yes, and a new installment of Astounding Frontiers early in the month.
Woo!
All right.
So many other projects.
Yes.
We have too many projects on at Superversive Press at the moment.
Do we?
It's going to be insane.
All for your reader enjoyment. Anyway.
You have no idea. All right. Anyway, signing off.